Our guest tonight is Jonathan A.C. Brown, professor at Georgetown University and author of the book Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World. Jonathan Brown was born in 1977 to Jonathan C. Brown and anthropologist Dr. Ellen Clifton Patterson. He was raised in a Christian household as an Anglican, converted to Islam in 1997. Dr. Brown graduated magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts in History in 2000 from Georgetown University. In 2006, he received a doctorate in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago, cum laude, in Islamic thought. He is fluent in several Eastern and Western languages. He is currently working as an assistant professor in Islamic Studies and Muslim Christian Understanding in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Georgetown University. He is also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islamic Law. And his published books are The Canonization of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, The Formation Function of the Sunni Hadith Canon, Muhammad, A Very Short Introduction, and again, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in Medieval and Modern World. So, thank you, Dr. Brown, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. Does this work? Okay.
So, Dr. Brown, professors, of course, have to publish or perish, but there's always a choice as to what you're going to write about. What inspired you or led you to write this book?
Well, I actually wasn't inspired to write it. I was asked to write it. This is, so many years ago. When I realized I had to talk about this, I sort of had to plumb deep into my memory. I was a grad student. It was probably the winter of 2000, so December of 2005. No, it must have been earlier, November of 2005. And Dr. Omid Safi, who's a professor at UNC, who's written a couple of excellent books, the most recent one being Memories of Muhammad, which is a very good book. I recommend you bring him. He'll be happy I advertise for him too. He asked me, he's the editor of this series. This is called Foundations of Islam series for One World Publications. And he asked me and another professor who was older than me named Scott Lucas, who's also Muslim, and he writes on Hadith, and he was professor at the University of Arizona. He asked us to co-write this book on Introduction to Hadith. And I said, okay, sure. And then Scott, I talked with him, and we came up with a plan for the book. And then Scott said, actually, I can't write sort of a more introductory volume. He was already a professor, so he had to write something really serious and couldn't do this. So he ended up backing out the project, which is, not only are we good friends, but also our moms were good friends, which was very interesting, kind of weird cultural continuity there. But so I ended up being the only one doing the book. And at that time, I was working on my dissertation still. I went to Cairo in the beginning of 2006, and I started the work in the beginning of 2006. And then I finished it probably, just about 2 years later or so, two and a half years later, and then that was sort of the story of the book. But it was really out of the blue, and it was, initially I think I probably would have been too intimidated to write the book, but once I agreed, I guess I was sort of presented with a challenge. So that's unfortunately, the rather uninspiring story of how I wrote the book, or how I began to write.
Yes. Well, you mentioned studying in Cairo. So you've done Islamic studies in Georgetown or University of Chicago and Cairo. Could you say something about what it's like studying Islam in a Western framework and then in traditional Islamic country?
They both have strengths. I think that one of the things I would say to Muslims in America is don't think you're going to learn your religion from a college class, right? In fact, I think a lot of times Muslims shouldn't really go to take classes on Islam in college, because a lot of times they just get introduced to things that are really not very useful and confusing, and then they end up getting disenchanted or disillusioned, and it's totally unnecessary. I mean, it's not like there's things that are being hidden from them, but I mean, they just get introduced to all sorts of issues that are sort of tangential to their religion. So anyway, that's, I think, one of the big differences is in the Western tradition, Western academy, you learn about things, you don't learn the thing, right? So in a Muslim country, you really get to focus, or in a Muslim educational center, even here in the United States, you get to actually learn your religion, or at least some certain interpretation of that religion. Another thing is, I'd say it's generally true that amongst Western academics, there's, with the exception of a few scholars, there's sort of a really underlying contempt for Muslim scholars. They sort of think that Muslim scholars are, especially today, are kind of silly, they're not serious, they're kind of these defunct relics of a long since, I don't know, extinct civilization. And what I discovered when I studied, especially in Cairo, is really the tremendous strength of Muslim scholarship and the incredible intellect and openness and real scholarly commitment of Muslim scholars. And again, if you take 100 professors of any place, probably 80 of them are going to be not that interesting and useful, and maybe 20 will be good, and then there'll be 1 or 2 who are really good. And it's the same thing with Muslim scholars, right? So it's not surprising that every Muslim scholar is not Hujjat al-Islam al-Ghazali or something like that. Rarely you're going to get somebody of that quality. But when you do meet people like that, and you see that they are Muslims whose faith is so important to them, but who are still have reached the highest level of intellectual achievement, that's something that's extremely inspiring and really inspired me as a Muslim and as a scholar.
I remember in your book you talked about how you met a Muslim Hadith scholar, where it's in Yemen, or and he actually recited to you a Hadith. And it was sort of a very dramatic moment, almost from reading in the book, almost as opposed to just like reading about the Hadith transmitter. Here was one in front of you and giving his complete isnad or chain of transmission. Can you say something more about what it's like to study in that kind of mode versus in a Western modern mode?
Well, I think the biggest difference is you see these are living sciences. These aren't things that are relics of the past that we study to understand, what went wrong or how do we get here or something. But you see these are they're living and they're also adapting. So they're not reified or sort of unable to change according to circumstance. And to see, and another thing is just, I would always, when I'd read, Bukhari memorized, 600,000 hadiths, and so memorized this number. I'd say this is ridiculous. No one can memorize this. This is obviously made up, and no one memorizes whole books. And when you meet people who literally memorize entire books, for a Muslim scholar, really good Muslim scholars, their brains are like computers. It's really incredible. I can't stress this. You really have to see it. For me, I had to see it to believe it. There are people who, they'll say, this hadith appears in this book, and it has this isnad, and it appears in this book, and it has that isnad, and this is the problem with the isnad, and then they recite everything to you, and then they recite some poetry for you just for the heck of it, and then they recite a bunch of other stuff to you. And then to see them take that information, sort of structure it to answer a question, come up with the various possible responses to a question, then try and pick the best question for, let's say, whatever question, the certain time in which they are in, or the certain need being presented to them. That's when you see, I think, Islamic scholarship at work, and that's very inspirational. And so I guess the sort of recitation of isnad for me indicates, one, that these things are alive and living sciences, and two, that they're you see how these sciences are operationalized.
Let's back up a little bit. What exactly is a hadith? Mm-hmm. Why are hadith important, and why is it in the West we all hear about the Quran, but most people don't know anything about hadith? Maybe now you've heard of the word.
A hadith is a report about something the Prophet ﷺ said or did, or something that was done in his presence of which he approved. In Shiite Islam, it's also something that an imam does or says or is done in their presence. And you have basically 2 parts of the hadith. You have the text of the hadith. So, if we just imagine a saying like, don't put your feet on the table. That's the text of the hadith. And then you have the isnad, which is the chain of transmission of the hadith. So these are the 2 parts of the hadith. The reason why, in Sunni Islam at least, Sunni Muslims have always said that the sunnah of the Prophet, his precedent, his authoritative precedent, is rules over the Quran. We understand the Quran through the Sunnah. The Sunnah is actually more powerful than the Quran. And the Quran needs the Sunnah to be unlocked and for us to understand it. So when people in the West sort of focus on what the Quran says and what this says and that says, they don't know that the 5 daily prayers don't appear in the Quran, right? So many important beliefs in Sunni and Shiite Islam, like the Mahdi, like the return of Jesus, things like this don't appear in the Quran explicitly, right? So they think that, they have the Bible, and so they assume that there's this Muslim Bible that has all the answers, just like our Bible has all the answers. They don't realize that there's this sort of second layer of interpretive information that adds actually the bulk of Islamic law and dogma. So that's one of the reasons I think the book is, I think what I study is very important, because I think that it's important to teach people about so that they can understand how and why Muslims believe what they do.
And say a little bit about exactly how your book covers Hadith. It seems to be pretty comprehensive.
Yeah,
what kind of,
I'm big on one-stop shopping, right? So that I guess that was a joke. I'm not sure. I really like books. I can't stand books that have titles like Islamic thought. The thought of Fulan ibn Fulan in like the year 1012, and that's the whole book is about this one person. But this isn't Islamic. This is one person. So I like books that say Hadith, and it's all about Hadith. You can pick up the book and you can say, I'm going to find everything I want to know in this book. I'm going to find all the death dates. I'm going to find book title. I'm going to find modern stuff, ancient stuff. So I really wanted to write a book like that, and I also wanted to show. The most important thing about Hadith really is how they're used in a lot of ways. So I wanted to show how Hadith are used in Islamic law, how they're used in Islamic theology, how they're used in Sufism, right? Big deal. I want to talk about Shia Hadith. Nobody talks about Shia Hadith in Western Academy. It's very rare. And I wanted to give an interior view of the Shia Hadith tradition. I wanted people to understand why Shia Hadith developed as it did. How it felt to be inside that world, and same thing with Sunni Hadith, but this is sort of generally treated, so it wasn't as much of I wasn't as worried about it. So I really wanted to just have everything in the book, and then of course also the Western debates about Hadith, Western scholar debates, and also equally important, if not more important, modern Muslim debates over Hadith. I mean, a lot of the real discourse and the real issue of contention amongst Muslims since the 1800s, in the modern period, is what do you do with Hadith? The Quran is pretty straightforward. The Quran is not a very problematic book for dealing, if you want to sort of implement it in the modern world. Most of the debates are about Hadith, and whether it comes to hijab and jihad and dealing with non-Muslims and things like this, most of these things are actually the issue rotates or centers on Hadith. So this is something that's very important as well.
And another thing that struck me from the book was sort of goes kind of counter to an assumption most people have that critical thinking about sources begins only in the West and only in modern times, or if earlier in the Renaissance. From your book, it sounds like that the basic principles of critical examination of sources, and even what a journalist does to review sources, begins very early in Islamic history.
I mean, that's one of the things also I wanted to do in the book, is to show. I remember when I first became Muslim and I would talk about Hadith, and people would say, "Brother, don't even try. It's too complicated. You'll never understand it." And I said, no one wants to study Hadith because they always tell you it's just too complicated. So I didn't study it until I actually met some people who were studying Hadith, and I realized that actually real human beings can do this. And then when you learn about Hadith criticism, you realize it's pretty, in its details it's very intimidating. The structure behind it is very common sense. And that's also what I wanted to communicate to people, which is that Hadith criticism is not, sometimes people think these Muslim scholars, are using some illogical or bizarre or faith-based way of thinking about Hadith, but for the most part, it's very the same way that we would all go about deciding if we were going to believe a story or not. And that's what I wanted to demonstrate. In addition, what you said is completely right. Muslim critical scholarship of course, there's certain things Muslims aren't going to criticize. They're not going to criticize the idea that the Quran is revelation. They're not going to, once Sunni Islam sort of coalesces in the mid-700s, early 800s, you're not going to criticize the companions of the Prophet, right? And these are choices that various parts of the Muslim community made. But in the actual methods they used, they're extremely critical. I mean, and they spent hours and hours and hours and years of their lives compiling different versions of stories and trying to figure out, using the same methods that someone like a European scholar in the Renaissance or a modern scholar in Harvard editing a book would use, trying to figure out what the most reliable version was.
And what do you think drives that almost obsession with being as accurate as one can get? I mean, they'll say you can only have probability.
Mm-hmm.
This drive to be exacting in determining the degree of reliability of a transmitter, degree of reliability of hadith. Why?
Because they're terrified of lying about the Prophet. I mean, you have to, there are the ethos of hadith scholarship in general, whether in Sunni or Shiite Islam, is this idea that you're preserving the teachings of the prophetic tradition, right? And every word matters, every dot and apostrophe matters, and this was a religious obligation for them, and they treated it with that amount of respect. They didn't, and in fact, that's kind of one of the things that irks me when people criticize the hadith tradition from outside. Is, look, you can criticize some of the assumptions, you can criticize choices made, right? But you have to be willing to devote the same amount of attention that these scholars did. And until you do that, I don't think you're really going to understand how they did what they did.
So in many ways, this book is sort of kind of a rebel, sort of going against sort of conventional ideas or approaches.
So I think so. I mean, I think that the way that most Western scholars have written about hadith is, I mean, they exoticize it, they don't respect it, they treat it as an object of the history of the past. But to look at it as something that's alive, that's worthy of respect, even if you don't agree with it. I mean, when we read Plato, we don't agree with everything Plato says, but we still recognize his genius and his importance. And it's the same thing with the hadith tradition. I think even if you don't believe that it accurately preserves the Prophet's teachings, you can still appreciate it as this massive and ornate intellectual edifice. So to the extent that the book does that, I think it goes against the way that most Western scholars deal with hadith. And if it pushes them more in that direction, then I'm very happy with that.
So in terms of talking about critical, I mean the different ways in which someone can be critical, in your book you say that hadith scholars are ready to criticize a hadith, but they don't assume from the outset the source is false. Mm-hmm. And you say there's sort of a kind of, what they say, called hermeneutic suspicion. There's an assumption that a source is guilty until proven innocent when it comes to religious documents.
Western scholars do that?
Right.
Yeah, Western scholars definitely do that. I mean, this is really kind of a creation of the German scholarship of the 1700s and the 1800s, which then inspires biblical scholarship and classical scholarship in England and the rest of Europe and then in America as well. And there's this great saying that one scholar says that a German scholar could disbelieve like 6 different things before breakfast. I mean, they would end up disbelieving a number of things that the end result they get is actually much harder to believe than all the other things they disbelieved, So it's very critical. It's almost a real contempt for documents from the past. You just don't, pre-modern, pre-Enlightenment humans were just sort of categorically altering and misrepresenting things all the time. To the extent that you just don't believe really anything, right? There's this incredible, like there's this one German scholar named Reimarus who dies in around 1764, 1768, and he wrote these criticisms of the Bible, which are just, I mean, it's just incredible. Like that the disciples of Jesus staged his, they went and stole his body in the middle of the night, and they took it away, and then they kind of came up with this idea of him being the Messiah. I mean, this incredible series of events that are almost, it's almost as incredible as the being resurrected, So that's the sort of level of skepticism that he had to the tradition that he was studying. Whereas Muslim scholars, it's kind of the opposite, where if someone comes and tells you a hadith, the default assumption is that this is true until proven otherwise. And I think this is actually a big, this is something really that Muslims should think about today is, when you hear a hadith, do you assume it's true until proven false? Do you assume it's false until proven true? Or do you say, I don't know, but I'm just not going to have an opinion on it? And I think throughout Islamic history, certainly in Sunni Islam, the assumption is things are true until proven false. That has led to, I think, some problematic issues in Sunni Islam, but we can get into that later.
Sure. And then also, going back to some of the uses of hadith in the Islamic tradition, there's so much that's said at sort of a kind of cartoon level about Sharia in the press today. Can you say something about how hadith are used in understanding and interpreting Sharia within the Islamic tradition?
Well, I mean, I'm actually writing this book now called Misquoting Muhammad, the choices and challenges of using the Prophet's legacy. And one of whenever people say, well, what hadith book should I read? What I tell them is, don't read any hadith book. Reading a hadith book is not going to help you understand your religion. Because if you imagine you are talking for 23 years, okay? And you're a leader of a community for 23 years. I mean, it's hard to figure out, let's say, what Barack Obama thinks about X, or what John Boehner thinks about Y. It's impossible, right? I mean, you have to go, how would you know what his policies are on certain things? You have to collect all their statements, to figure out when he's being specific, when he's being general, when he's being sarcastic, when he's talking to somebody in one circumstance, when he's talking to someone in another circumstance. Maybe his position changed over the years. So even if we can collect all the Prophet's saying, it's very difficult then to figure out what exactly his position on any one issue would be. And then how to take those words and principles and apply them in another situation, or to generalize them. So, you look at a book of hadith, let's say the Sunan of Tirmidhi, and there's a chapter on how the Prophet forbade drinking while standing up. The next chapter is the hadith of the Prophet drinking while standing up. So what do? I mean, and this isn't me going back and saying, wow, Muslims are so dumb. How could they have been bamboozled by this tradition? They knew this. This is why they were collecting hadiths. They were trying to figure out, look, we have this report from the Prophet saying this. We have this saying why. Clearly he had some consistent position, so let's try and figure out what it is. And it's no surprise then that in Islamic law you get numerous schools of thought and numerous opinions, because everyone's using this evidence in a different way and weighing it in a different way. So one of the things that I think is very important for Muslims to understand, and non-Muslims to understand, is that the Sharia is a process. Sharia is a process of problem solving. It's not a code. And that you have to understand that as a process, that Muslim scholars always acknowledge was probabilistic. Right? It's always something that's going to give you only a probable answer, and therefore you're going to get multiple answers. So you pick one, the one you think is best, and you go with it. That the Sharia isn't this draconian code. It's a process of trying to solve problems.